Hello, everyone. Bienvenidos. This is going to be the class talking about American history. We're going to go through sections from the colonists arriving to the Americas to the Cold War and 9/11. And so this is going to be a long class, but remember to practice and pay attention. Okay. So for previous materials in this class, if you go to this link, bit.ly/citizenship material, you can find all the material we've talked about in week 1, the civics class talking about the US government, and week 2, which is the US history portion of the exam. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the origins of the United States. And so before the United States, there were many Native American tribes. In North Carolina, there were plenty, Chocnoe, Croatan, and so forth. Other very famous tribes are the Navajo, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and Seminole. For estimate, there are 4 to 7 million Native Americans in the United States today. Pre-colonization, there was upward to 7 to 12 million. In comparison, there were only 2.5 million colonists when the United States independence was declared. Another history fact, so I'm from the Northeast, as some of you may know, and there's this college called Amherst College. It's worth right now $3.32 billion in 2022. Pretty good for a university. Well, one famous thing that it's in their history is that they used to give blankets to Native Americans to create peace, to create friendship. As many of you know, Thanksgiving is a holiday that we celebrate as the colonists and Native Americans gathered for a feast. Well, this was not as good of a story because these blankets were known to have smallpox. Has anyone heard of smallpox? Smallpox is a very deadly disease, and especially the Native Americans were not exposed to this disease in the Americas. Therefore, this was a means to remove Native Americans, and now we see how much property this university has and how much wealth this university has as an education place. There are different Native Americans, and they have different cultures and adapt to the different climates of the United States. For the United States exam, you only need to know one. So just get comfortable with your one. The Cherokee is very close to North Carolina, so this might be a tribe I might pick. Okay, now let's talk about the 13 colonies. For the United States citizenship exam, you only need to know 3. A lot of people like North Carolina, New York, and South Carolina naturally. You don't need to know the geography for these places, but it is good to know if you have kids or nieces or nephews to know a little bit of the US geography. I travel to New York a lot, so I take I-95 and I drive all through these states. If anyone remembers, there are 13 original colonies. 13 original colonies represents the 13 stripes of the United States flag. Now we have 50 states. And so how did we get from 13 colonies to 50 states? We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so if you were here for the civics class, we talked about this photo. This is a cartoon. Look at this cartoon. On the left, we see that there's a certain person with a gun. On the right, we see someone in a home, and they look angry and pointing away to the soldier. So this is the 3rd amendment in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights, as you know, are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And here it says, no quartering of soldiers. Now, why is this very important? Do you see military people in your home, or have you heard of military people living in your neighborhood? No. Now we have bases, and that's where our military lives. So why is it in our Constitution? So when the colonists were part of America or settled in America, they were still part of the British government. They followed British laws. Americas has a lot of wealth of goods, so of course they're going to be taxed, right? Any place there's money, the government wants to tax it. And so obviously they didn't want this. Also, they were upset that the British were forced to live in their homes. Now, has anyone ever had a guest before? When you have a guest, what do you have to do? Feed them, make room for them. Maybe your kids have to interact with them. Of course, the colonists wouldn't want this. We keep moving forward. And then the most important thing is maybe these things could happen, right? However, the United States had no representation in Great Britain. Great Britain on a flight is 5 hours away on plane. Imagine on ship. Do you think it's possible for a colonist to go to Great Britain for to represent the colonies? No, it's not possible. So people were upset that there was no representation from the U.S. colonists. And so we see here the reason why many Americans came to the United States was, one, freedom of religion. In Europe, there was a growth, and especially in Britain, there was a growth of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church is very similar to the Catholic Church, just under the king. And so there are a lot of people, Protestants, who wanted to leave for religious persecution. So many people really value this freedom of religion as part of coming to America. Right to bear arms. The United States could not have their own militia. They could not have their own military. So this was the right to bear arms, is to use guns, but most importantly, it is to create their own military force, which is important when there's no net of safety back then, right? And we just talked about the quartering of soldiers. And so when you look at the Bill of Rights, you see the American history, or why we came to America, right here. And so why did we have the Bill of Rights? These are amendments to the Constitution. This means that the Constitution has evolved to meet the needs of the United States citizens. Okay, moving forward. So we're going to have a little exam question. I want you to refer to a packet in the Google Drive. There are a list of 30 questions concerning the United States history. And I want you to, on a piece of paper, just write down. I really emphasize you writing down the answer, saying it out loud, because when you take the exam, you're going to remember, I wrote down my reasons. You're going to remember pronouncing your reasons. And I want you to really hold it to heart what you have to say. So you're going to see these questions throughout this presentation, so please be prepared to write it down on a piece of paper. So question number 4 from my packet. Why did the colonists fight the British? Take a second, pause the video, and write down your answer. Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to talk, we just talked about how the Bill of Rights was reasons why we fought the British. So here are some of the official answers from the exam. Number 1, high taxes, taxation without representation. Number 2, the British Army stayed in their houses, boarding and quartering, quartering meaning to stay at someone's house. And lastly, because they did not have self-government. Self-government is they couldn't make rules and laws for themselves. Okay, so now we have a bunch of upset colonists. They're being taxed. They are bullying the military. They are famously, they covered them in oil and feathers, and they were upset. Now, if anyone's heard of the Boston Harbor, the Boston Tea Party, they dumped all the tea, very valuable goods, into the U.S. harbor. So we have tensions, and finally, it's time to declare independence. 1776. Remember this date. Okay, this is the year where the colonies finally had enough and they fought the British. The Declaration of Independence was written by Thomas Jefferson. If anyone knows, has anyone ever seen a $2 bill? Right, we have $1, $5, $10, $20, $50, $100. Has anyone seen a $2 bill? Well, they're not much in circulation, but Thomas Jefferson's on the $2 bill. Fun fact, if you see one, it's actual money. So this sets off the Declaration of Independence is the beginning. It says we don't want to be part of the British government anymore. It was declared on July 4th, 1776. In this document, there are a lot of things that are important. So this is just the values of the United States, and it's really rooted in our government. So most importantly, you need to keep in mind that we wanted to have unalienable rights. The government can't take us. Our peers can't take us. What are those rights? We want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Repeat with me at home. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One more time. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Great. Moving forward. Thomas Jefferson, as I said, $2 bill. He is one of the founding fathers. Right? What does it mean to be a founding father? Well, he's one of our patriarchs, one of these male figures who helped all the paperwork, all of the mobilization. There are many people who were part of this revolution. It's just that these people are known as the fathers, the founding fathers. Eventually, he'll become the president of the United States. He is famously friends with the French. He actually never fought in the revolution. He was in France, some would say, having a party and having a good time. All right, so he's friends with the French, led to Louisiana Purchase. We're going to talk about that more in depth. And then lastly, he helped, he said that our government was weak. What do we have to do? We have to make it better. Bill of Rights making our Constitution stronger. George Washington, all right, this one's on the $1 bill. He is the commander-in-chief. Why? Because he led many of the Revolutionary Wars in the Revolution. And they looked up to him and they said, you need to lead this government, right? Because who are we going to trust? The man who was in charge of all the battles, right? He was the president. In the executive branch, Joe Biden, Bush, Clinton, Reagan, all of these people who have started wars in other countries. Why can they do that? Why don't we have to have our senators or U.S. representatives do that? Because they're the commander in chief, right? The president gets to decide, right? Because he was the one of our first generals, right? And so this is very important. He had to figure out how to be president. How do you be president of a new country that has no money, right? It takes how many days to get to Washington, D.C. or New York from North Carolina on foot? Many days, right? How do you get people to go represent the government, right? So this was a very early inception of the government. All right, Benjamin Franklin. Anyone know the Liberty Bell? The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. I've seen it in person. It's really good. I recommend you go see the history of the United States in Pennsylvania. He's another founding father and a scientist. Move on. Okay, exam question number 12. I want you to get your piece of paper and pen. Who is the father of our country? Who is the father of our country? ¿Quién es el padre de nuestro país? Write down your answer. I'll give you the answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. George Washington, okay? Father of our country. Founding fathers, there are many, but the father of our country, George Washington. Okay, so we just declared independence. This is just a document. What does it say? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so now we have to make a government, right? So originally we have this document called the Articles of a Confederation, but people didn't trust this, right? It was a weak government. People were scared to turn into a Great Britain. And so they created a new document at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Everyone repeat with me. 1787. 1787. Okay. So a new constitution was approved and adopted. And so this document still, the Constitution we know today, was still contested. So what did they have to do? They wrote the Federalist Papers, right? There's a musical, if you look up online, I recommend. It's called Hamilton. He's one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. There's a song where he wrote 51 of 72 documents, right? On your exam, you only have to name one. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. 10 years ago, I remembered memorizing John Jay because I like the alliteration. But now I can look at this musical and Hamilton, right? He's on the $10 bill. Okay. So we talked about how we had 13 original colonies in 50 states. So how did we get there? So these were done throughout the 1800s, our expansion, and famously was the Louisiana Purchase, right? And so now, if you remember, there are people still living here, of course. We saw all the native indigenous tribes. It was 2 to 7 million people. Yet the people who had the power, they were able to sell the land. So Louisiana Territory from France, right? What was happening in France at this time? There was a French Revolution, right? People were having their heads chopped off. There was no government. There was a king. There was no longer a king. Anyone who had any source of money, the peasants tried to kill them. Very unstable time. So what did the French need? I need money. So what did the French do? Thomas Jefferson, please give me some money. I'll give you all this land. Right? And so this is one of the states that we got from this. Okay, so review. Hopefully you're paying attention. When was the Constitution written? When was the Constitution written? When was the Constitution written? ¿Cuándo fue escrito la Constitución? I'll give you an answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1787, right? Declaration of Independence, 1776. Constitution, 1787. 11 years later. No, 12 years later. Okay, I'm from Maryland, and so this is our license plate, and I spent my childhood looking at this, and I said, why is it War of 1812? Well, War of 1812 was the only war the United States has ever officially lost. What happened? Well, if you don't recognize this building, this was the White House at one point. And you see now it's all in fire, right? If you go to Washington, D.C. right now, it is a maze to get to the White House. There's no one direct road from that leads you to the White House. And why? It was because the British burned down the White House. And so now I think it was like the Canadians or the British, but it was the only war we lost. And so now we remember War of 1812. The Star Spangled Banner came from this song. Despite all of this violence, that the flag was still was still strong. We move on. Okay, now we're going even more westward. If anyone's from Mexico, does everyone know how the history of Mexico? Mexico used to be a very huge country, right? And eventually a war happened that was led by Texas, right? There were settlers and colonist settlers in Texas, and they just wanted more land. And this war resulted in the addition of these states. Do you see how we're growing as a country? You just need to know that this war exists, but it's important to know just the history of Mexico and how we got all this land. California, a wealth of resources. Eventually, we'll be mining here. The gold rush. Has anyone heard of the gold rush? There's immigration from China at this point. There are railroads being built. There was growth in the West, but very early. Okay, so you can do this at home. I will skip through this in the video, but we're doing a geography activity. If you can print out the map, that is great, but if you cannot, that is okay. I wanted you to label in one color the 13 colonies. You have to pick 3 for the exam, so label your 3. I'd pick North Carolina, South Carolina, New York, right? This is New York over here. The Louisiana Purchase, just to reinforce, is this land of territory, more or less. And then the states won by the Mexican-American War are in the blue. So if you can, practicing, if you have kids, nieces, nephews, it is good to teach them some geography or help them with their homework. So I would say get comfortable with this, but don't know this for the exam. Moving on. Okay, take a break right now. Pause the video, do a stretch break. Make sure you answered all the questions previously. And I will keep going in the video. This is a song.
After the war, I time. Keep on fighting in the meantime.
Yeah, there's a lyric about Hamilton wrote the other 51. Okay, now we're moving on. We're still in the 1800s, okay? So I wanted to ask you, what type of businesses do you think are happening in these photos? Okay, so here, this is Ford Motors. This is in the 1900s, but I think it's still a good example, right? Does anyone know Detroit? Does anyone know Cadillac? So these are all places in Michigan where there's a lot of factories and commerce, right? Well, all our cars we know. We didn't have Americans here at this point, but just for the illustration, this is in Detroit, Michigan. This is in the north. And then down here, what type of commerce do you think is happening here? If you said plantation, sugar, cotton, tobacco, that is correct. We're in North Carolina. We're famous for the Reynolds family. They're a major tobacco company in the 1800s, right? And so this was a very wealthy industry, right? Cotton, right? All of our clothes were made of cotton back then, was very difficult to come by. Clothing, we get a lot of that from clothing. Sugar is a very rich good that we were able to transport to other countries. Tobacco, of course, the smoking industry, it was very profitable. Good commerce for in Europe, right? So now I have to ask you, where these which building is in the north and which is in the south? Right? If you said that the top one is the north, you would be correct, and then the bottom is the south. And this is simply due to the geography. The geography here in the south has really great tobacco and sugaring, all these things called cash crops, right? And then, so here, what type of work are you doing? You're doing manual work, right? And famously, we'd have slaves in the South who would do this, right? Because you would not be able to do this by hand. And so in the 1400s to now, we still had trade with African countries or African kingdoms. We sold them guns and we took their people as slaves. Many people died on the way to the United States or the colonies at the time. And since then, there was a lot of labor and a lot of money in this industry. In the north, on the other hand, you have seasons, right? You don't have that much agriculture. Has anyone seen the Appalachian Mountains? Do you think you can plant in the mountains? No, no, no. So in the north, they did a lot of commerce and trade and industries, right? The factories. If you've ever been to New York City, you see a lot of smoke. If you go to Philadelphia, you see a lot of smoke because there's a lot of industrialization in the north, right? Two different places. Do you think you need slaves for this type of work? Probably not. So a lot of people were poor early Americans, and they worked in factories, right? Different types of commerce. So now we see today Ford remains as like one of the top companies, and then tobacco industry, right? We still see this today. Obviously, they're historically important. So the Civil War is a 4-year war. Civil being, I guess, within the United States. And so in the northern states were free, right? People could do labor. In the southern states, there was slavery. Southern being Maryland and to the south, right? And so the north is more industrialized. There's more factories, railroads, and some agriculture. But the south has cash crops, right? As we just talked about. So there are different economies. And the South felt like they were being taxed by the government. The South did not like that the North was deciding all the things. At the time, I think it was in the capital was New York, or the capital of the United States was in New York and moved to Pennsylvania. Eventually, it made its way to DC. But you see how there's more strength in the North than in the South. Abraham Lincoln did not like slavery. And so, first of all, exam question. Name the U.S. war between the North and the South. Name the U.S. war between the North and the South. Nombre la guerra de Estados Unidos entre el norte y el sur. Okay, we just talked about it, the Civil War. Okay, 4-year war. Okay, and so the southern states wanted to maintain slavery, right? That's how they had their commerce. That's how they maintained their plantations. They also said that they wanted states' rights. They wanted to not be part of the United States government, especially when there was a president who wanted to abolish slavery. Eventually, this war was won by the Union, the northern states, and eventually the 13th Amendment would outlaw slavery, right? A 13th Amendment is adding to the Constitution, fixing the Constitution, making it better. And so this was a very brutal war, especially in the South. 2% of the population died, right? So a lot of people died in this war. How does this affect families? How does this affect government? To this day, there is a lot of economic differences between the North and the South. Civil War can be one of these examples. Right, Abraham Lincoln. So this is a picture of a plantation. You see, these are kids. These they would be born from slaves, and then they would still be belong to the master. You'd see like kids in the farm or the plantation, and this is cotton. And here you can see the soldiers gathering for war. Yeah. And very important, and this is the first war where this is one of not the first war, but this is one of the major wars where Black people were allowed to serve in the military, of course, because that means they represent the United States government, and so this means that they were now kind of more seen as people. But yeah, moving on. I can't do the history lesson for the South as well as you did. You just like know the picture so well. I'm trying. Yeah. All right. So exam question. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? We didn't talk about this, but how did we get to the freedom of slaves or the outlaw of slavery? Right? How did we ban slavery? So this was a document, Emancipation Proclamation. It freed the slaves. It freed slaves in the South or the Confederacy. Right? This is a document that meant that the Union won, that the South, the Confederacy had to be maintained part of the United States, and most importantly, that it abolished slavery. Okay, last war. This is the Spanish-American War. Has anyone ever heard that of the American presence in a lot of countries, naval bases? We talked about territories, right? They're not states. There's no representative in the government, but the United States has some authority over the land. Puerto Rico is famously one of these states. Guam is in the Pacific, and many other, we eventually got many more small islands in the Pacific, right? This is during the time of imperialism, right? So there's some African countries that speak Portuguese. Why? Because the Portuguese went to some African islands, Seychelles. If you go to Indonesia, right, they speak French. Why? Because the French moved in and they called it Indochine. The United States was trying to do the same, right? They were trying to take up land far away and take the resources from the land. And so here we were able to gain authority over Puerto Rico and Guam. Famously, the United States helped get Philippine independence. However, it's important to note that the Filipino revolutionaries were the ones who were able to separate them from the Spanish, and it was only a deal between the Spanish and the United States to make it look like the United States beat the Spanish in the war. So really, it was the Filipinos who won this war, not the Americans, but history wrote it this way. Okay, now we've gone through many wars. Go to question 15 in your packet and look up and write down your answer to this question. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s. Nombre una guerra peleada por los Estados Unidos en los 1800. Write down your answer. Revealing the answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we talked about the War of 1812. The White House is burnt down. The Mexican-American War, how we got Texas through California. The Civil War, this famous war that brought the Union together and abolished slavery. The Spanish-American War, where we got Puerto Rico. Okay, take a break, please. Make sure you filled out all the answers to the questions we had before. Pause the video, take a stretch break. Okay, we're back to class. So now we're going to talk about World War I. So World War I is a testament that the world is getting more complicated, right? There are more superpowers happening. For example, there's the strength of Britain. They had the best ships, they had the best military, they had commerce in India and other places. Lots of strength. France, they started gaining power. Russia, the Russian Tsardom was strong. Italy, they're becoming a strong economic place in the Mediterranean. They're sort of a country at this point. The United States is entering the scene, right? The United States, very far away from Europe, obviously, but it's growing in power, and the other countries want to know what the United States will be in the future. There were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. These are historically, has anyone heard of Constantinople? Right? And so there were other, back in the 1000th century and prior, there were two major empires. There was the Byzantine Empire and what's the other empire? Yeah, the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, right? And so the Byzantine Empire would be more like where Ottoman Empire would be, or Austria-Hungary. All All right. And so why did the United States enter this war, right? So war means wasting money. War means sending military. War means helping a side. So why would the United States get involved? So famously, there's a story when there was a telegram that was sent from Germany to Mexico, right? What does this telegram say? This telegram said, well, Mexico, you lost land from the United States in the Mexican-American War. You know what would be good is if you helped us with the war, right? And then get the United States back. And so the United States found out about this message, and they said, no, we're going to enter this war. We're going to be a player in the competition of Europe. Okay, eventually the World War I, right? What's most important is that it ends in losses, right? Who loses, who wins? One of the losses that's important is that the Germans had to pay for the war. They lost the Treaty of Versailles. Everyone in Europe blamed Germany to pay for the war. And then all of these countries here would break up into what we now know. Yeah, Bulgaria. Importantly here, this is Russia. Look at how big this land is. Russia was still governed by a czar. There was serfdom, right? It's not slavery, but people basically were not free. They belonged to a land and they worked. They got paid, but they worked, unlike slavery. But still great poverty, right? And so this tsardom collapses, and then now the people can be free. Poverty in Russia. How is this going to play out? Well, we'll see the rise of communism soon. The Soviet Union. Okay, during World War I, we had Woodrow Wilson. He was seen as a very strong man. He said he walked with a big stick. Has anyone heard of Panama Canal? Well, he's responsible for that. And he wanted to be a big gorilla in the United States. He wanted to be the big man. So the 14 points was just him trying to show that the United States is going to be a major player in the global stage. Okay, so exam question. Who was president during World War I? Who was president during World War I? Pause the video to write in your answer. ¿Quién fue presidente durante Guerra Mundial número 1? Okay, the answer is coming in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Woodrow Wilson. Okay, World War II, right? So where did we leave off of? Germany had to pay a lot of money. There was growth of nationalism, right? Fascism. So there's the growth of Nazi Germany, right? And this happens slowly over time. It doesn't happen all at once, but eventually you see a lot of hatred. The Holocaust happens. It doesn't happen overnight, but it slowly people join. And we see that 6 million people died in the Holocaust, and there was a lot of atrocities happening there. Germans wanted, and why did this happen, right? So why did the Holocaust happen? Well, the Nazis believed that there was one superior race, right? You had to be Christian, you had to be blonde, you have to have all these qualities that make the perfect race, right? And then any other minority, like the Jews, like the Romani, like the Gypsies, they were interfering with this global plan, right? And so this isn't the only country to be thinking this way. Japan, it's not even on this map, right? Japan had the same sentiment, right? They were growing in power. They conquered China. They conquered Korea. If you ever take a exam of like an ancestry test in Asia, right? There's some people who are historically generationally Chinese. They could have Japanese ancestry, or Koreans who could have Japanese ancestry, right? And so they were taking up the Pacific. Mussolini is another fascist. He helped Hitler take up Europe. But these were three called the Axis powers. These people wanted to be the best, the most superior race, the most dominant power, and they wanted to conquer any neighboring countries to do so because they wanted their vision. Right. And so this was a very brutal war that has destroyed Europe economically since then. And it were the Allies, France, England, the Soviet Union, the Russians, right? And then the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. But this war was happening in many countries. It was happening in Africa and Asia and Europe. Noticeably, the United States, there's no major war that happened there, except we entered this war because Japan, which is in the Pacific, they bombed one of our military bases, Pearl Harbor, and this entered our war. Something that's also interesting is that the United States gained a lot of money from this war, right? So here's where many people died in the United States, very far away. What did we gain from this? Industry. We sold guns. We had a lot of money come in, and a lot of the infrastructure and power that the United States sees comes from this war. Lastly, during this war, previous to this war, why would we join this? Why would we want to make so much money? Because in the 1930s was the Great Depression, right? So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was president for almost nearly 3 terms, and he oversaw the Great Depression in World War II. Great Depression. Has anyone heard of the New Deal? Well, if anyone has heard in the news, Biden tried to pass the Green New Deal. And so the Green New Deal, it talks about environmental policy, but it's a play on words of the New Deal from FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so this is where we saw the growth of Social Security. Why would we want Social Security, right? When you're retired and you can't work, how are you supposed to make money? During the Great Depression, we saw a lot of poverty and unemployment. So what did the government do? The government created jobs, right? And so there would be people for a couple of cents a week or a month, they would go plant trees. Has anyone taken the interstate highway? The interstate highway was a means to create new jobs, right? National parks were created. This was a way to get Americans unemployed. Previous to this, there was a president called Hoover. Hoover did nothing to stop the poverty that was happening in the United States. And so here we created new jobs, right? And so we see the government back then, George Washington, he was the executive, he was the commander-in-chief, he oversaw the military. Well, now we see that the president, in times of crisis, has the power to create these policies, right? And for good reason, or else the United States would be in shambles. Okay, so who was president during the Great Depression and World War II? Who was president during the Great Depression and World War II? ¿Quién fue presidente durante la Grande Depresión y Guerra Mundial número 2? I'll give you answer in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. If you take your kids to Washington, D.C. on vacation one day, there's a really beautiful mural. I recommend you going to see it. Okay, now we're entering a time where many of you have seen in your own life, in your own countries, and might know a lot. And so we're going to briefly talk about the United States and their role in the Cold War, but this is still an ongoing war. Some would say this is in 1991. This is what? The Berlin Wall. What do you see, soldier? What is this? Falling down, right? The Berlin Wall was a symbol of tension between communism and capitalism, the Cold War. Okay, so for an overview, the Cold War is an ideological war that happened in many countries, but most importantly, it's seen as between the Soviet Union and the United States. So in the World War I, we saw that there was the fall of the Tsardom, no more Tsar. There was also serfs. There was great poverty. And in this, there was growing idea of class sentiment, right? The poor against the rich. And one dictator came and oversaw this and said that in order to prevent this disparity between the poor and the rich, the government has to come and they have to take control of all of the factories, of the culture, of the people to prevent class conflict. That was the growth of the Soviet Union. Not necessarily communism as an idea, but through the dictator of Stalin. So what's the problem with the growth of communism? Well, what is capitalism? What is a free market, right? A free market means I can make trade, I can make money, and who gets to stop me? No one, not the government. I can do what I want. And so if there's a growth of countries that want to have a government control their commerce, if the government decides, how can the United States go to another country and take advantage of their labor? How can the United States make treaties, get factory workers? Most of our clothes are made in other countries. How can the United States use cheap labor, get free resources if the government is stopping them from doing so? Right. So the Cold War is an economic tensions, right? It's ideological in stopping the growth of communism, but it also prevents the United States or other countries from being able to do free trade with other countries. And so World War II, the United States had the growth of industry. We made lots of military weapons. We had a lot of money, and during the Great New Deal, we have a lot of jobs. So we were the country that survived the war the best. So the Soviet Union, as you know, was a communist country. The United States was a democratic and capitalist country. And so the United States feared that communism would counteract its presence and power abroad. Has anyone ever played dominoes before? Right? Do you have dominoes in a line? When one domino falls, what happens to the next domino? It falls again. And the other, it falls again. And so the fear the United States had at the time is that the first domino would be the Soviet Union. And what will that do? It'll fall on China. It'll fall on East Germany. It'll fall on Vietnam, Korea, and eventually it will hit the United States. And so the fear of the Cold War is that the growth of communism would reduce United States global power. And so this war happened in many countries to maintain democratic and capitalist countries. One of these wars is the Korean War. The Korean War was in the 1950s, where North Korea and South Korea, as we know, were fighting between communism and capitalism. So the Chinese and the Soviet Union supported North Korea, which we now know as a dictatorship, Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il and his and that family, whereas the United States supported South Korea and tried to maintain democracy there. South Korea now maintains a very rich, wealthy country. They have Samsung, they have LG. They are one of the most educated countries in the United States, or not the United States, in the world. North Korea, there's extreme poverty. In 2012, I recall there was a brutal famine. This is not one of many famines, but I remember in the news, there was a story of a man who had to eat his own kids. Great poverty, great brainwashing. And if you watch a movie in North Korea, which many people have, you can see that all of the movies try to exemplify the government. Every single narrative is like some woman who gives up her life to serve the country in the greater good. It's very much brainwashing. Kim Jong-il loves film, and that's why they use film as a means to do dictatorship. That aside, we still see that these two countries are at war. And so before COVID, there was nuclear missile testing from North Korea. And so there was fear that North Korea has the means to like start a war. It is just a matter of when. All right, we keep going. Vietnam War. So Vietnam War, I don't know if anyone has heard, was a very famously unpopular war. What was going on in the culture in the 70s, in the 60s, right? The hippies, right? Does anyone know what was happening after World War II? Was the growth of universities, right? Many universities were being built. Why were the universities being built? Well, after World War II, the United States promised people in the military to get a college education, right? To educate the workforce. Right. And so now you have a lot of people who want to go to college, but what's going on? Well, now there's a draft. So there's hippies, people getting more educated, there's families, and the war movement is becoming less popular. So in Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a very famous president. Why? Because he was president during the growth of radio. And what can the president now do? The president can now communicate to the people through the radio. And now we're growing in being able to have photography, film. And so Vietnam War was the first war that was recorded. And so I don't know if anyone has seen war, has heard of war, but war is very brutal, right? A lot of children are displaced, a lot of homes are being destroyed, a lot of infrastructures and poverty and hunger is happening in countries. And this is a war where the growth of chemical warfare, right? And how ugly that is. Agent Orange is one of these. And this is one of the wars where we can see, first it's publicized. You can see what happens when the United States goes at war with other countries. And this was happening everywhere. But this became a famously unpopular war. Why was it also famously unpopular? Because a lot of people died. So in Europe, right, you see the little castles and the cows and the pasture, right? It is easier to fight in Europe than it is to fight in Vietnam. Why? Because Vietnam is a tropical country. And so the brutality of this war is also because of geography. And so many Americans died because they didn't know the geography, they didn't know the language. And so no one could say at the end of the war ended in a ceasefire, but no one really won. Not communism, not capitalism, not the Vietnamese. If you go to Houston, Texas right now, there's a huge Vietnamese population. Why? Because they were refugees of war. So this was a very brutal war that changed the narrative of America winning every single war. We did not lose, but we definitely did not win. All right, Gulf War. Now we're getting into the 90s. And so now we're seeing the growth of power in the Middle East. And so there is Kuwait, which is famously rich of oil, and people like oil. So there's a British presence, a democratic presence in Kuwait, whereas Iraq wanted to take more land, and Iraq sided with the Soviets. And so this was another ideological war for more money. We keep moving because I don't know much about the Gulf War. So exam question number 26. During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? During the Cold War, what was the main concern of the United States? Durante la Guerra Fría, ¿qué fue el primario preocupación de los Estados Unidos? This is a one-word answer. 3, 2, 1, communism. Okay, we move on. Who did the United States fight in World War II? Who did the United States fight in World War II? ¿Quién los Estados Unidos pelearon en Guerra Mundial número 2? Okay, World War II, the Axis powers. Germany, the Nazis, right? Japan, they bombed us, and Italy, friends with Germany. Okay. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1900s. Nombre una guerra peleada por los Estados Unidos en los 1900. Answer coming in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War, Gulf War. Okay, so we talked about foreign policy in the United States. Now we're going to talk about briefly domestic policy in the United States. So we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. And the story I'm going to tell is a little graphic in nature, but I just want to tell you the stage of what happened to Black people in the United States after the Civil War. So, question, what did the Emancipation Proclamation do? What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? It freed the slaves. What does this mean? You can't have someone in slavery. And what does slavery mean? You own someone and you can get to them to do what you want. You can't let them live outside of your home, etc. Well, obviously, if the South depended on labor, if the South depended on plantations, then what they did isn't let people go to college or run for government. They did the equivalent of slavery. So Black people would work on plantations. They would get little money and they could barely they couldn't become their own farmers. They couldn't own their own land. It was really difficult. And so I want to tell you the story. This story happened in the 1950s. But here there's a picture. And so this is a mom and this is a casket and this is her son. Her son was between 12 and 14. I don't remember the age. His name was Emmett Till. Emmett Till is from Michigan, but he went to go visit some family in Mississippi. Mississippi is remains one of the poorest states, remains one of the most segregated states in the United States to this day, 50 years later. And so what happened? What happened to this boy? And so this boy went to go visit family. He went to a shop, right? Voy a contarle esta historia en español porque creo que es bien importante. Bueno, aquí vino este niño y fue a una tienda y dijeron que él silbó a una señora blanca, americana, que fue dueña de la tienda. Silbó, le dijo algo inapropiado. Bueno, el esposo de la señora y su hermano fueron a llevar el niño y lo abusaron y lo mataron con una pistola, pero lo abusaron y la mamá encontraron el cuerpo del niño. Y aquí se puede ver cómo salió este niño. Este niño tuvo entre 12 a 14 años y así salió. Entonces, ahora tenemos tecnología para publicar esta tragedia. Y por todas partes en Estados Unidos movilizaron para que fueran que hubiera un jurado para esta gente que lo mataron el niño. Y el jurado fue componido de 100% gente blanca. El jurado tomó 15 minutos para escuchar el caso. Fue bien obvio que esos hombres lo hicieron y ellos no dijeron que sí lo mataron al niño. Pero salieron libres los hombres. Después, una semana más tarde, las periodistas vinieron y preguntaron a los hombres de lo que pasó. Y le dijeron los hombres al periodista que el niño no hizo nada a la esposa. Bueno, esto fue un caso de obviamente brutalidad entre la gente blanca y los afroamericanos en esta época. Y no solo es el único, pero es el más famoso. Ahora, esto fue por suerte que alguien le tomó foto, pero ¿cuánta gente no le tomaron foto? Si han escuchado el crecimiento de la Ku Klux Klan, fue de que quieren tener superioridad de la raza blanca, mantener la raza blanca y bajar todas las otras minorías. Bueno, yo creo que es una buena historia de que esto permanece y todavía sigue, pero esto fue un caso uno de los muchos casos que movilizaron el crecimiento de los derechos humanos. Back to English. So the civil rights movement was can be a nonviolent movement, can be to end racial discrimination. And so many people would go to counters where they would not serve Black people. And they would stay at the counter because they deserve service. Rosa Parks, she would sit in the front of the bus instead of the back of the bus because she has the right to. Who has kids? So Le voy a contar otra historia de que un examen de la muñeca. Hay niños de 5 años, de 0 a 5 años, y le dan muñecas a una americana blanca y una afroamericana niña. Y le dan una muñeca blanca y las niñas le preguntan, ¿cómo piensas de la muñeca blanca? Y le dice, y la niña blanca obviamente le gusta, y después la niña afroamericana también le gusta la muñeca, la llama bonita, la llama, quiere ser eso. Después las dos niñas le enseñan una muñeca afroamericana de piel morena. La niña blanca no le gusta la muñeca, pero también la niña afroamericana le llama fea a la muñeca, le llama, no quiere la trata mal a la muñeca, y esto fue a la edad de 5 años. Los niños a esa edad no conocen el racismo o no saben cómo odiar a otros, pero se enseñó que por la segregación hasta en los mismos niños se nació se aprende la superioridad de la raza blanca. Bueno, Brown v. Board of Education fue lo que decidió para la segregación en escuelas, porque se vio que esto afectó la psicología de los niños. También había protestas en esta época y eventualmente permitieron que los afroamericanos pudieran votar. ¿Por qué fue esto importante? Porque en el sur, hasta en Norte Carolina, en Mississippi, cuando un afroamericano quiso tomar un examen, ¿qué le preguntaron? Le preguntaron un examen de los Estados Unidos. Ahora, no hay internet esta época. Ellos no tienen acceso a educación. La educación termina a la edad de 12 años. Leer es difícil. A los blancos americanos no tienen que hacer estos exámenes. Si quieren sacar para poder votar, ellos tienen que, ellos publican en los periódicos quién fue a sacar la habilidad de votar. Bueno, así no dejaron que gente tuviera miedo de poder votar, porque los que los empleaban pudieron quitarle el trabajo, gente pudieron ir a asesinar a la gente que quiso votar. Entonces, esta es una importante figura. What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? What did Martin Luther King Jr. do? Él fue un pastor que él movilizó la comunidad afroamericana en el sur. Él fue a muchas iglesias a ver que no hay injusticia como se están tratando a los afroamericanos, y él fue un parte del movimiento de sin violencia a protestar al gobierno. Y este es y él peleó para derechos civiles. He fought for civil rights. Otro movimiento que tiene que ver con la habilidad de votar es the Voting Rights for Women. Y Susan B. Anthony fue una de las mujeres que ayudó que las mujeres pudieran votar con el 19 Amendment, the 19th Amendment. Bueno, that's all. This was a very in-depth history class, but you only need to be able to answer some of them. Hopefully the context helped memorize or learn the material. And feel free to revisit and practice the rest of the questions in the practice exam. Thank you very much and goodbye.